Tonight.
Strike on the line. Congress steps in to avert a railroad shutdown.
We must avoid a strike. Jobs will be lost.
Plus, protests in China.
A rare public challenge to the world's most authoritarian government.
And raising rates. The Fed's dirty work to tackle inflation.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. With billions of dollars on the line, Congress moves to keep the trains on the tracks. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
And from our news bureau in Washington, I'm John Jessup. The threat of the first national railroad strike in 30 years is forcing Congress to use its legislative authority to avoid another hit to the economy.
The House swiftly passing legislation guaranteeing rail workers will keep the country moving. CBN News correspondent Brody Carter is following the story. Brody, Congress stepping in like this is really a last-ditch effort.
Well, John, Jenna, since this is considered a national security issue, Congress is taking advantage of laws that force union workers to go back to work under terms of a contract they recently rejected. Overworked, understaffed, and no paid sick days. That's the rallying cry shared by more than 100,000 union rail workers. They're fighting to spend more time with family and not be punished for taking sick days.
The big issue that rail crews are pointing out isn't so much the pay that's the problem, but quality of life.
In September, President Biden helped avert a rail strike by imposing a 30-day cooling-off period, giving more time for rail unions to consider a deal brokered by Labor Secretary Marty Walsh. It would have increased worker pay by 24% over 5 years, with caps on health care costs. It failed, however, to offer paid sick leave, causing 4 out of the 12 unions to reject the deal, leading to this current strike threat.
Everyday Americans should absolutely be watching this because of the inflationary pressures this has for food and energy, really core costs.
It's not one of those real sexy things that get the headline until something bad like this happens. Transportation is what makes the world go around. That's what keeps food on the shelves, what keeps the economy going.
A rail strike could cost the economy an estimated $2 billion per day and bring the supply chain to a screeching halt.
For too long, the railroads ownership have made obscene profits on the backs of workers.
House leaders stepped in Wednesday, voting to avoid a work stoppage.
Quite frankly, the fact that paid leave is not part of the final agreement between railroads and labor is, in my opinion, obscene.
Congress added a second bill giving workers 7 days of sick leave. While the bills could prevent a strike, some believe Congress shouldn't be meddling in private enterprise.
This is a mess of their own making, and they're going to make it a whole lot worse. If they go off the September agreement, it'll just kick the can down the road. September kicked it to here. This is going to kick it into next year, and then we're going to do this all over again with people even more mad.
Analysts tell me they're worried a strike could bleed into the trucking and ocean freight unions, standing in solidarity with the rail unions, further straining an already choked supply chain. If a new agreement can't be reached, railway workers vow to strike by December 9th.
Yeah, Brody, of course, the bill still needs to pass the Senate. When are we thinking the Senate might vote on this in order to send it to the president's desk?
Today, President Biden said the Senate must act urgently. He's warning that supply chain disruptions could actually begin as early as this weekend. Some fertilizer tech companies, they've already rerouted shipments to trucks. Now, they are in session tomorrow, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has promised a swift passage. John, Jenna?
All right, Brody Carter, thank you very much. Well, it is a new day on Capitol Hill. House Democrats electing their new leader, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who will replace outgoing House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as the party's leader.
That's right. When he assumes office in January, Jeffries will become the first black leader of one of the 2 major political parties in Congress. CBN's Abigail Robertson joins us now for more on the historic vote. Abby.
That's right, John. While outgoing House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will remain in Congress, she will officially pass the leadership reins over to Congressman Jeffries next year, after almost 2 decades leading House Democrats. Stepping aside with her are 2 of her top deputies, Representatives Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn, whose leadership positions will be filled by Representatives Catherine Clark and Pete Aguilar. None of the newly elected leaders faced opponents in the closed-door votes today, and the new generation of Democratic leaders praised their predecessors following today's vote.
We stand on their collective, broad shoulders, building upon the incredible work that they've done, excited about the opportunities to advance the ball for everyday Americans as we move forward into our future.
And in other big news on the Hill, yesterday 12 Senate Republicans joined every Senate Democrat in voting to pass a bill that secures federal protections for same-sex marriage. Now, some Republicans argue it lacks religious freedom protections and could lead to faith-based nonprofits who partner with the government having to surrender certain religious beliefs.
Religious liberty groups all over the country and religious institutions started contacting our office and putting out their own statements in opposition to this bill, saying the bill as currently written, even with the quote-unquote religious protections in it, do not actually protect the religious liberty of all Americans.
The bill now heads to the House for final passage, and it will likely be signed into law by President Biden before the end of the year. John, Jenna.
CBN White House correspondent Abigail Robertson. Thanks, Abby. Well, here with us now is Patrick Miller, pastor of The Crossing in Columbia, Missouri. He is also co-author of the new book, Truth Over Tribe, Pledging Allegiance to the Lamb, Not the Donkey or the Elephant. Great title. Patrick, thank you for being with us. Let's pick up where Abby left off with the Same-Sex Marriage Act that passed in the Senate Tuesday night. There are a lot of concerns among churches and religious organizations that this will result in endless litigation over Christian groups and LGBT issues. Patrick, what's your take on the concern over religious freedom loopholes in this bill?
Well, you have multiple voices contending multiple perspectives. Some people say that the protections inside of the bill are robust and we should accept them because we might not get a better bill in the future. However, there are many others who are arguing that this is not a robust enough protection. Of course, we'll find out in the future what ends up happening.
Yeah. You recently put out a podcast examining what it looks like for the church to show love to the gay community, to reach out. Patrick, how should the church engage with the LGBTQ community?
I believe that the church should not close its doors to LGBTQ people in the same way that we shouldn't close our doors to people who struggle with greed, to people who struggle with pornography, and a whole litany of other issues. Of course, if you come inside the church and come to meet Jesus, he is going to change your life. He is going to change your sex life. He'll change everything about you. But if we begin thinking about our churches as places primarily where a certain kind of person cannot come and hear about Jesus, I think we've stepped on the wrong foot, especially in a culture where now about a quarter of Gen Z self-identify as LGBTQ. If we want to reach them, we have to open our arms to them. That doesn't mean that we end up turning our back on traditional sex ethics. It means that we are kind, welcoming, generous to them.
Christian conservative author David French has voiced his moral opposition to gay marriage, but also he's come out in support of the Respect for the Marriage Act. You say you disagree with his take.
I do. I have great respect for David French, and he's making a prudential argument that this might be the best bill that we get. He's also making an argument as a civil libertarian. My main problem with that is that I'm not a civil libertarian. I believe that we need to have laws that order society to the common good. Now, to do that, we have to balance order and freedom. Too much order, you have tyranny. Too much freedom, you end up with anarchy. And I believe that as a libertarian, he's emphasizing too much freedom in this case. It's going to lead to a kind of sexual and marital anarchy.
Patrick, just a moment ago when you were talking with Jenna, you'd mentioned the statistic about a quarter of today's youth identify as LGBTQ. You talk about showing kindness and love to them. I got to ask, because I would imagine that you have a lot of evangelicals who are concerned about balancing love with truth. So how do you make sure that that's not watered down when you're talking about loving the other?
Yeah, you know, I like to ask the question this way. If you were talking to someone who isn't a Christian, who was incredibly greedy, they kept all their money for themselves, they did dishonest things for dishonest gains, and they asked you if they could come to church, of course you would say, yes, I want you to come and be a part of my church. And if they came to faith, eventually you would need to address those problems. But you would understand that they need to come to know Jesus before they ever came to the position where they would actually be able to resist the greed that was characterizing their lives. The problem is that we want to deal with LGBTQ issues before we deal with Jesus. People aren't going to have their sex lives changed until they know him and his spirit's working inside of them to transform them from the inside out.
You, as we mentioned earlier, are the co-author of the new book, Truth Over Tribe, Pledging Allegiance to the Lamb, Not the Donkey or the Elephant. Can you tell us about the book, why you decided to write it, and its message and purpose?
Yeah, we wrote the book because when I look at the church today, we are being divided by politics. And this isn't anything new for the church. The early church was divided between Jews and Gentiles. But Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, wrote that Jesus' death tears down the dividing wall, and that when Jews and Gentiles came together, they proclaimed to the powers that Jesus was king. The powers didn't organize their lives. They wouldn't separate. And in the same way, we need to proclaim to the powers that say that political parties should remain separate, that liberals and conservatives can't worship alongside each other. We need to say, no, you're not our king. Jesus is our king, and he unites us.
All right, Pastor Patrick Miller, it's always great to have you on, and we appreciate you coming on this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, the fight to combat inflation. The latest on the next steps of the Federal Reserve when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. The pace of the Federal Reserve's series of interest rate hikes finally could begin to cool down as soon as December.
Yeah, welcome news for some people. Stocks ended the day up after Fed Chairman Jerome Powell signaled that possible slowdown, even though inflation remains at record highs.
By any standard, inflation remains far too high. The path ahead for inflation remains highly uncertain. Ongoing increases will be appropriate. It seems to me likely that the ultimate level of rates will need to be somewhat higher. The full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Thus, it makes sense to moderate the pace of our rate increases as we approach the level of restraint that will be sufficient to bring inflation down.
And here with us now is Stephen Moore, chairman of the Freedom Works Task Force on Economic Revival. Steve, always good to see you. Thank you for coming on tonight. Were you surprised by this? Were you surprised by this move, Steve? Inflation's still soaring at unprecedented rates. Is it a good idea for the Fed to start pulling back like this?
Well, I wasn't surprised, and boy, Wall Street sure had a big champagne celebration when they heard that news, because the market went way, way up. The stock market and investors on Wall Street are just addicted to this cheap money, and they don't like it when the Fed raises rates. I think they'd rather have a little inflation than higher interest rates. But, you asked the key question, though, which is this the right policy for fighting inflation? It's yet to be seen. We have seen some improvement in the last couple of months of inflation coming down from its high of about 9% to a pace of about 5 or 6%, which is an improvement. But that's still a really high inflation rate. Let's not forget that when Trump left office, the inflation rate was 1.5 to 2%, which is sort of where we want it to be. So there's still a lot of work to be done to bring inflation down. But I would say that the most important thing, much more important than the Fed raising interest rates, is that the Congress has got to start radically cutting government spending. The reason we got inflation up to 9% was the massive multi-trillion-dollar spending bills by Biden that were paid for by debt and by printing money. And until that comes to an end, we're going to continue to see high inflation.
Stephen, interestingly, despite the high interest rates and record high inflation, the U.S. economy grew at an annual rate of about 3%. It was 2.9% annually from July through September, the third quarter. Stephen, does that suggest a healthy underpinning of the economy?
Well, if you look at the first 9 months of the year, the rate of growth of the U.S. economy was about 0.1%. So, we've had very, very little growth over the course of the last, the first 9 months of this year. The economy shows some signs of picking up, but a lot of economists are thinking that we might have a pretty severe recession. I have to say, I'm very worried about our financial situation in this country. When you have the federal government under Biden spending and borrowing and printing $4 trillion of money that we don't have, then you have on the consumer side, $1 trillion of consumer debt. So Americans are running up their credit cards to pay their bills. That can be an ugly picture. I don't know about you, but the Moore family can't just keep running up our credit card month after month after month without at some point paying back those bills.
Yeah, especially with rates, rising like they are.
That's right.
Changing tack here a little bit. There are reports of shortages of pharmaceuticals, Steve, like the antibiotic amoxicillin, the antiviral kinds of medications, and even other over-the-counter drugs like children's Tylenol. What is your reaction to this news on an economic front?
Well, it shows that we still have not solved the supply chain problem. this was supposed to be solved 6 to 9 months ago. Remember, Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, was supposed to solve this problem. And so you've had intermittent periods. Remember, we had the baby food shortage, a few months ago. And so this just shows we have not solved that problem of getting the goods to the market and to the shelves of the store so that people can buy them. So very disturbing. At the same time, of course, you talked earlier about this on the show, the rail strike. I mean, you think we got supply chain problems now. Think about how bad it would be if this rail strike goes forward. It looks like there might be a congressional intervention to stop that, but that's probably going to only be temporary. So we have to see if this can get resolved. But we didn't have these problems when Donald Trump was president.
You just mentioned supply chain, the railroad strike. Do you agree with Congress taking action to step in based on the Commerce Clause? And if they don't step in, do you think it's likely because of these railroad unions striking that we might see other unions begin to strike as well?
I'm quite undecided about whether it makes sense for Congress to intervene here. I mean, I don't like government intervening in these kinds of things, but I understand that, rail is really pretty critical to our transportation infrastructure. So I would much rather see an agreement, a shake the hands of agreement between the rail companies and the rail workers. But your point about whether there will be more labor strife and more strikes, I think is a really good one. And the answer to that is yes. I think we will see more of this. And you know why? It's because we have had, 9 months now of 8% inflation or more. And so workers are feeling financially squeezed. And the more they feel that squeeze, the more they want to agitate for higher wages. You can't blame them because their take-home pay is being reduced. And so I guess what I'm saying is this is the cost we pay for Bidenflation and letting the inflation get out of control.
All right, Stephen, we're going to have to leave it there. Stephen Moore with FreedomWorks, we always appreciate you taking time for us today.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you.
And coming up, a rare challenge to China's authoritarian government. What the unrest means for the future of China and the world. Welcome back. The former Chinese president who led his country to become a global power has died at the age of 96. Jiang Zemin rose to power on the heels of the 1989 pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. After that crackdown, Jiang ruled the Communist Party for 13 years. His death comes amid growing unrest over China's pandemic lockdowns. The country's zero-COVID policy backfiring against Chinese President Xi Jinping, with protests and scenes of defiance throughout China and around the world. The rare public challenge, the largest demonstration against China's ruling Communist Party in decades.
A diplomatic dispute is spilling out into public view. It centers on an FBI investigation into the death of a Palestinian-American reporter several months ago in Israel. As Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, the move is creating tension between the United States and its closest ally in the Middle East.
On May 11th, Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh died from a crossfire between Israeli troops and Palestinians in the city of Jenin. While the Palestinian Authority blamed the IDF for deliberately killing Akleh, it refused the offer of a joint investigation or produce the bullet that killed her. In September, the IDF finished its investigation, concluding it was likely accidental gunfire from the IDF that killed Abu Akleh. The U.S. State Department initially welcomed the findings, although now the FBI is reopening the case into the death of this dual Palestinian-American citizen. Israel's outgoing Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, slammed the decision.
The IDF is a moral and ethical army. Those soldiers and commanders of the IDF protect Israel, thoroughly investigating any out-of-the-ordinary event, and are dedicated to the values and rules of democracy. The IDF soldiers will not be investigated by the FBI, nor by any foreign entity or foreign country, however friendly it may be. We will not abandon IDF soldiers to foreign investigations, and our fierce protest was delivered to the Americans in the appropriate ranks.
Israel's defense minister Benny Gantz calls the Justice Department decision a mistake, adding that we will not cooperate with any external investigation and we will not allow interference in Israel's internal affairs. 20 Senate Democrats signed a letter asking the FBI to get involved. The report also sparked a response from Senator Ted Cruz, who issued a statement calling the alleged investigation an outrage. and said that everyone involved, including Attorney General Merrick Garland, should be fired or impeached. Israeli commentator Ruthie Bloom believes domestic politics in Washington is behind the renewed investigation.
The Democrats have been targeting Israel throughout the whole Biden administration, and they have been singling out Israel for censure about everything they can, unfairly. And first of all, the fact that they put pressure on the FBI does not mean that the FBI has to accept it. They don't run the FBI, but it's symbolic.
CBN News reached out to the FBI for a comment, but have not yet received a response. Bloom feels the move is meant to put Israel in a bad light.
I don't even think that something is going to come of this, but the damage it does to Israel's reputation and the regurgitating of a case whose only point from the Palestinian side was to blacken Israel's name and yet again accuse Israel of murdering innocent Palestinians that was the point of it. That was the only point.
The FBI investigation comes at a time of strained relations between the two allies, just as Benjamin Netanyahu is forming a coalition government. It has already seen interference from the Biden administration, and this incident could potentially make things worse. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
From sparkling lights to celebrating the reason for the season. Stay tuned for an annual CBN Christmas tradition. Finally tonight, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas at CBN headquarters.
That is right. The Founders Inn and Spa Hotel, located on the Virginia Beach campus, just held its annual illumination ceremony. Capturing the Christmas spirit, the event includes everything from horse-drawn carriage rides to Christmas carolers and even a visit from the big man himself. Of course, we're talking about Santa Claus. Christmas also, of course, as we know, isn't complete without Christ, and a traditional reading of the Christmas story by the 700 Club's Terry Mewson. To cap off the night and ring in the season, the Christian Broadcasting Network lit up the surrounding gardens in what's called the Grand Illumination.
Absolutely beautiful. Well done.
How come we weren't invited, Jen?
I know. We needed to be there.
I feel like we missed out.
All right. Well, we will see you tomorrow, December 1st.
Thanks for watching.